Welcome back, everyone. This will be the final video in our series of videos on the topic of prayer. In this video, what we're going to try to do is just kind of do some review and connect some of the dots about things that we've talked about. I'm going to take a so what, and so now what approach to this. Let me explain what that means. The so is, so let's talk about something. Let's have some topic to discuss, and our topic clearly, obviously, was prayer. So let's talk about prayer. Let's study prayer. The so what is, well, what about it? So what about prayer? What is it that makes it matter or makes it significant or that I should be concerned about it? And so we'll spend a couple minutes talking about the so what, and then we'll move to the so now what. Now that we've talked about prayer and learned some things together, so now what? What happens now? What do we do now? Do we change some behaviors or do something different or just move on? And so is, let's talk about prayer. Let's talk about the so what. What did we say in our study of prayer? What did we learn together? In the first three lessons, we learned several things. In the first lesson, we talked about praying to a God who wants to be close to us. Yes, He is the creator of all things and all-knowing and all-powerful, but He's also a loving God who knows us better than we know ourselves and wants to have a close personal relationship with us. And when we bow in prayer, we need to realize that we're praying to that personal God who knows and cares about us. And that makes a difference in our whole attitude towards prayer. In the second video, we concluded that we need to not do all the talking in our prayers, that there are times when we need to be quiet and listen to what God has to say. After all, if we're praying to the creator of the universe and who's all-powerful, but we don't take time to listen to what He has to say, then that's not respecting who God really is either. And so in the second lesson, we said, you know what? Let's listen to what God has to say as opposed to doing all the talking. And in our third lesson, we looked at several scriptures that made it clear that the effectiveness of our prayers is impacted by how we live our lives. If we submit ourselves to God, do what God asks us to do in the way He asks us to do it, our prayers will not be hindered. And so we talk to a personal God and we take time to listen and we enhance the effectiveness of our prayers by giving ourselves over and living the way God would have us live. And then in the fourth lesson, which was really the eye-opener to me when we looked in Matthew chapter 6 at the Lord's Prayer, and then in the rest of the New Testament about the instruction on prayer and the examples on prayer, we saw that the vast majority of topics of prayer were for spiritual matters, not just earthly requests, but over and over again for spiritual matters. And so what we learned there is that when we look at our typical prayers, too often it's for earthly, personal request type of matters as opposed to spiritual matters. So that led us to spend the rest of our time looking at a few spiritual matters that we should be praying for more frequently. The foundation for our spiritual topics was the greatest commandment, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which would lead us to want to reveal God to the world, which really is the role of the church. And based on the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, which really leads into the purpose of the church, to seek and save the lost. And so we had a solid foundation of what the church is and of what Jesus said was the greatest and second greatest commands. And we use that as a foundation to look at four spiritual topics that we ought to be praying more frequently for. And that foundation that we talked about should lead us to pray, first of all, to be filled with God's will and His Spirit and His holiness. If we love God, we'll want to be filled up with Him. And that then will help us reveal Him, to show Him to the world. The second topic we talked about is that we should pray for the lost. Jesus said he came to seek and save the lost, and that's the purpose of the church. So we need to be praying for that, praying for the lost, and praying specifically that we would have a role in that God would use us in order to reach out and show God and bring others into a saved relationship with God. And then in our third spiritual topic, we took a little bit of a turn and we looked at the topic of suffering, and we saw over and over again that those who were out preaching and teaching and bringing others in and living the Christian life oftentimes suffered. And one of the verses even said that we should be willing to suffer if that be the will of God. So God may use us and use suffering in our lives to reveal himself and bring others to him. And so we should be praying that we would be willing to suffer if that's what God needs us to do. And then our fourth and final spiritual topic, we talked about needing to pray for unity and for oneness. And Jesus prayed for that. One of the last things he prayed for before his arrest and trial and crucifixion was to pray that we would be one. As a matter of fact, he said perfectly one, like he and God are one. And he made it clear that he wanted us to be one so that the world would see and know that God sent Jesus to this earth for them. And we talked about how divided and subdivided we often are, and how we need to be praying for that unity that would help the world understand God sent Jesus to this world. So we talked about being filled up with God's will and his holiness. We talked about praying for the lost. We talked about praying to be willing to suffer if we need to for those lost and for the unity that will show the world who we are and who God is. So that was the so what. That's the what that we talked about prayer. And so we move now to the so now what? Now that we said, let's talk about prayer, and then we talked about prayer and learned several things together. So now what? What happens now? Does anything change? You know, there's really a couple of options when you think about this. Option one is to check the box and move on, to say, well, you know what? We talked about prayer, we studied, we had some good discussion, so got that one complete. I'll move on now. I feel good about myself. I thought about prayer. Option two is to start praying differently, to take what we've learned and to put it into practice and try to have that study that we did change who we are and change the way we think about and conduct our prayers. It's pretty clear to me that the better option is option two, to have what we studied change us and change our behaviors and affect in real time in our lives the prayers that we offer to God. I think we all know that that's the better option. The question is, do we have the will to do that? We know that's the better option, but will we have the discipline in our lives to make that happen in our lives? As we close this video and this study, I want to turn to one last Bible verse when we look at how do we move forward, the so now what portion of all of this. I think it's important that we let the Bible be the last word on this. I'd like to turn to James chapter 1 and verse 22. It says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." Another translation of that says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." I like that translation. Do not merely listen to the word and deceive yourselves. In other words, I listen to the word and think I've really done something because I've listened. No, that's deceiving yourself. And James says clearly, do what it says. We've talked about prayer and learned several things, and James now encourages us not to be hearers only, but do what it says. I pray that the words of James will weigh heavy on our hearts and minds and will cause us to move forward, praying as God has instructed us in His Word and has given us so many examples. May those words from James help us not to be hearers of the Word only, but doers of the Word. Thank you for being a part of our study. I hope it has encouraged you. I hope it will help you in your life moving forward. And I hope the words of James weigh heavy on our hearts, as I said, and cause us to put this into action. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of our study.